Welcome back, everybody. Everywhere I go, those two letters are kind of looming over me. Well, our next conversation on stage now, it's obviously part of the AI theme, but also part of our Founders series. And we're bringing together a topic of conversation that was certainly very high on the agenda here at 4 years from now, especially over at MWC. A good few years ago, a lot of excitement in the late 20-teens around autonomous driving. Speaking with my consumer journalist hat on, and this realization that soon we could be driving driverless cars, and manufacturers making big claims that we won't need a steering wheel in a car, and not a great deal has happened on the consumer side, certainly since then it would seem, but things are absolutely moving forward. Here we are in an AI wave, in an AI era, and our next conversation is really going to be about the clash of those two things, about AI, embodied AI. That's what we're going to be talking about for the next 2 or 3 sessions, but really this is about AI cars. Join me in welcoming to the stage, here to talk about AI-defined vehicles, autonomous driving. From Applied Intuition, it's Qasar Younis, and our moderator for this session, Natalia Olsen-Urtecho.
Well, this is exciting. We're very happy to be able to be here at 4 years from now at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, one of my favorite cities. And I'm really excited to be able to welcome, especially an amazing entrepreneur like Qasar Younis. We are kind of neighbors. I do live between Barcelona and the Bay Area. And when they told me he was coming, I was just like, wow. His company also has offices here in Europe, which we're going to talk a little bit about. His journey went from engineer to starting a company to being one of the founders of Y Combinator. And one of his companies got acquired by Google. And now he's starting again, and a company that is doing really, really well, Applied Intuition. And we're going to hear about his experience, learn from him, because I think here in Europe, we need to get that inspiration to go from startup to scale-ups. And Qasar, so lovely to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So tell us, you were an engineer, then you went to start a company. How was that experience? What are some of the takeaways that we could say to some of our startups who want to scale and also be acquired?
Yeah, I mean, the first step in terms of being a engineer and moving over to being a founder is understanding the motivation and why you want to start a company. Everybody's different. At least for me, the motivation was probably 3 things. One is I was poor, and startups are a great way to become rich.
Yes.
Being an owner of a business. Number 2 was I worked at some great companies. I worked at Google and I worked at YC and stuff. But I think fundamentally I don't like working for people. So that's it. And number 3, I think, and this isn't just propagating the Y Combinator kind of school of thought, and maybe Silicon Valley school of thought, is I really do believe the biggest impact most people can have is starting a company. If you're an employee at Google, at Oracle, at Facebook, wherever it is, you can have an impact, but I think your real skills are exercised when you're a founder. So it's not for everybody for sure, but I think for the people it is for, it's highly, highly impactful. So that's the kind of path. I mean, I'm in my 3rd company, so this is my path that got me into startups, 15 years ago. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about it.
15 years, and how quickly you've been able to get that to that level, right? And to your point, it is not easy.
It doesn't seem quick.
It is true. I can't believe it's been so long in that sense. And to the people in the audience, I think what I want for people to understand is that it's not at all hard. I mean, it is so hard to start a company. It is so, you cry, you have to fire people, you have to, pivot again and figure this out.
I think it's easy to start a company. It's hard to make it successful.
Good point.
Yeah. I think in the Bay Area, because that's what I know, and Y Combinator, what I know. I mean, YC's funding, 1,000 companies a year, so it's a real machine. But certainly most of those companies don't succeed. And so I think the thing that Silicon Valley's figured out, that other ecosystems are trying to figure out, is just the institutional knowledge around financing, starting, recruiting, growing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like even people talk about the United States as a startup ecosystem, but really most of the money that's invested in the United States for early stage is in the Bay Area. It's not in New York, it's not in Seattle, it's not in Austin, even though they all have their own small ecosystems. So what the Bay Area benefits from is everyone over the last 70 years has learned how to be great at marketing in tech, or how to be great at legal tech, and just engineering in general. And I think that's where in the European ecosystem, you're still in the early phases of that.
Very true, because in the EU, when the Horizon funding and Next Generation funding came through was 2012. And I remember that because I was coming here to talk about those programs. So it's only been 13, 14 years, and it does take time. But it's important is the regulations around it, building the ecosystem. Because I like to tell people, Silicon Valley wasn't born out of nothing. It actually was an underutilized zone. When the silicon industry went down, the US government put money into it, created the SBIC program. And what it did was give money to investors to go and invest in the craziest things. So when you have that balance, right, between government and the local ecosystem, I do say that 50% of all funding in the world goes to the Bay Area, because one thing that we do well, I think, in the Bay Area is that we help each other a lot. If I can't invest in you, I will go ahead and get my 10 other investors to come and invest in you. I think that sharing and caring is key.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think for me, the most important thing is there's a giant engineering culture.
Yes.
I think in a lot of these, conversations, what's missed is these are technical companies, and you need software engineers generally, but engineering broadly, to build these things.
Absolutely.
And, if you look at China as an example, China has invested a lot in engineering, not in almost anything else, right? So I think the Bay Area really has that huge advantage of huge amounts of engineers. And then, the reality is the engineers are the ones, unlike almost every other ecosystem globally, the engineers are the ones that start the companies, the engineers are the ones that become rich, and the engineers are the ones that invest in other engineers.
Exactly.
Rather than you could say an investor class. You go to London or you go to New York, Berlin, a lot of the investors are professional investors. Mm-hmm. And founders, anyone who's a founder who pitches a professional investor, there's a frustration because you realize that the person on the other side doesn't really understand the technology. And then they have a very simplified view of the business or of the product, and therefore the business. And I think in the Bay Area, when you have technical people investing in technical people, the dollars are more efficient because people know what is real and what isn't real. Generally speaking, there's always a misappropriation. But I think that's kind of the underestimated aspect of Silicon Valley.
And that's a great point, because
So if I was
getting to the point, yes?
Yeah, if I was Europe, I would be investing a lot more in engineering. I mean, that is the beginning, middle, and end. And I think a lot of times, especially for non-engineering degrees, humanities, history, etc., there is some resentment or dislike, or say, oh, the humanities are very important. Yeah, they're important, but they're not important in building a technical company.
Yes.
Only peripherally are they important, because maybe you want to have a good organization, you want to have an organization that is, thoughtful about its impact to society, but those are all third, fourth, fifth points. The first point is the organization has to be able to build products.
Exactly, to the product, right? Yeah. Because you do not want that product to fail, especially when it comes to technology and so on.
Tactically, the nature of starting a company, if your founder's in the audience, the reason the founders should be engineers is, generally speaking, the first attempt isn't going to be correct. You're constantly course adjusting. Mm-hmm. Here's a more fundamental question. Why are there not big Bay Area companies that have offshore offices in India or in Eastern Europe or somewhere else? It's because those companies can't iterate, and the people who write software are not responsible for maintaining that software if they're in Indonesia or they're in Brazil or wherever they're at. And therefore, what typically happens is engineers who are sitting in the room with the founders, iterating quickly, they can almost find that path of product market fit. And again, that requires everybody to know the technical underpinnings of the problem that they're working on. If you take Applied as an example, we're about a
Exactly.
1,000-person company, and 83% of our company is engineering. 8 out of 10 people are writing software, and
wow.
that is an extremely high number. Sometimes you go to quote-unquote technical companies that only have 1 out of 5 people who are engineers,
Oh, really?
or 1 out of 4 people are engineers. Even Google, which sets a benchmark, is 50% engineering. It's not 70 or 80% engineering. Why that's important is if your product is a technical product and most of the staff is sales and marketing, that's not a technical company. And therefore you have less of a technical advantage.
Tell me a little bit more about Applied Intuition, because I think you went to 1,000 employees already, and most of them are engineers. But what are you trying to solve exactly? And how does AI play a role in this? Because during the conference, we've been talking a lot about AI, and I think the audience would like to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, very, very simply, we make software and AI that vehicle manufacturers, car companies, commercial trucking companies, defense companies, construction and mining companies that have physical vehicles, we sell them, software and AI systems. And there's a bunch. We have multiple dozen products that we sell to them. But in automotive, all the major European companies are customers of ours.
Oh, wonderful!
So, as an example, so when they need to figure out autonomy, they might need some engineering tools in order to build and test and develop that autonomous system. We sell those engineering tools. Or if they want an autonomous system, we sell the autonomous system. If they want an operating system that is on the vehicle, we sell them that. So we're very much a software supplier into vehicle manufacturers. And so my original career, I started at General Motors and I started at Bosch, big German company.
Oh, okay.
So, and then I moved into software, and so I've combined both the automotive background and the software background into this company, which is now, we're 8 years old. I mean, more impressive is not the 1,000 people. More impressive is, I think, the company is, we've raised 600 million, but we've been profitable for a vast majority of the company's history. So we don't use the money we've raised. I think we've probably totally raised more than $1 billion now.
Wow, $1 billion by now. That's wonderful. And we were speaking a little bit earlier, and you've doubled every year. You have been increasing that in every year. When the company was started, what was the gap that you identified? Because we've been talking about autonomous vehicles for many years, and here in Barcelona we have a wonderful conference called the Smart City Expo, and autonomous vehicles has played a conversation for many years. Where is it that we can find new ventures or new ideas within the same realm of autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, so it's important for us to get on the same page of what's happening in self-driving cars. There's 2 general approaches to self-driving right now. One, I'm going to call them, broadly speaking, the Waymo approach and the Tesla approach, though many companies, especially in China, are approaching this in their own way.
Yes.
But the Waymo approach broadly is very expensive compute, lots of sensors, a mapping system, and a true no driver in the driver's seat self-driving car.
Yes, that's
the
true.
Tesla system is cheap sensors, mostly camera, with a cheap compute, and essentially made for consumers to buy from a company and to use. Waymo is a rideshare system. So in this Tesla fashion, the big kind of fundamental question is, can that ultimately become driverless? Where right now, in order to use Tesla FSD, there needs to be a person in the driver's seat. So
Yes.
The way to think about self-driving is nobody in the driver's seat or somebody in the driver's seat. But they're both automated driving. The big debate within the ecosystem is, so the Waymo way is real. You can go to San Francisco, there are many hundreds of vehicles. Actually, Waymo does more rideshare rides now than number 2 player, which is Lyft. So it's Uber, Waymo, Lyft now in San Francisco. Waymo is opening to 10 different cities and testing this year.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see an expansion of the no human in the driver's seat robotaxi service in the US in a pretty significant way. On the Tesla way, it is the drivers in the seat, and it's mostly a urban and highway system, but you always have to have a human in the seat. Every automaker globally is essentially building their own version of that system, of
the Tesla system.
The Tesla system.
Yeah.
And so I think, where we as consumers will interface with self-driving most likely will be from the passenger vehicle side, the Tesla style systems, as they become more and more advanced. The Waymo style systems, I think, will still take some time to grow because of the geographic expansion is quite slow. The other big question on the Waymo style, because again, there's many companies that are trying this. Waymo is just the most furthest ahead and the most famous. The real fundamental question in robotaxis is, what is the business model, and is that business model going to be sustainable? Because what a Waymo is really competing against is typically low-end labor. Labor who's driving their own personal vehicle, competing on prices against this robot, which is the Waymo car. And the reality is that labor is willing to be, to go quite low in terms of costs. And on the other end, you have a very expensive vehicle. So that business model is still to be determined. When we talk about AI, we talk about robotics, and you talk about whether it's regulatory risk or safety or impact on economy, the fight between Uber drivers and driverless cars, which is going to happen over the next 5 years, starting with San Francisco and then other cities, is going to be the early indication of what really happens in that ecosystem. I'm not somebody who falls into the category of, if every city had driverless vehicles, including Barcelona, that we would be doomed and everyone would be out of a job.
No.
There's been no experience in history where more technology has led to less jobs. It's always been more technology equals more jobs.
Yes.
Because even when you have something like Uber emerge and the taxi cab monopoly's broken in lots of cities, then you have food delivery and DoorDash and all the companies that have kind of come from there. And there are more jobs actually than when it was just the taxi companies.
Exactly.
And so I think with driverless, I don't know how, I don't know in which way it will be, but typically if history is shown, you'll have more jobs. But that's the current state of the industry, is the robotaxi system or the driver in the loop passenger car system. That's what all of us understand. There's a kind of secondary and tertiary revolution happening, which is in construction and mining, in commercial trucking, in agriculture, and all of these other industries where there's a big machine that a human is either monitoring or managing. Those will become more and more automated. And I think the real AI revolution that we're going to see and live is going to be in this universe. NVIDIA calls it physical AI. Other people have different taglines for it. But it's basically the automation of machines.
And the physical AI is really important because I think, a lot of people have either demonized AI. We've been using artificial intelligence for a long time, since the 90s and earlier. And now it's just a lot easier, more usable. People can apply it for new industries, like you're saying. And I think that it just makes the employee and the founder and the entrepreneur more efficient. We're trying to create more efficient ecosystems for our citizens. And when autonomous vehicles started, when I see them back in the Bay Area, Waymo, I imagine how they would be doing in these tiny little streets, in our European cities here. And it's tough to imagine an autonomous vehicle without smart buildings around it. That connection, the construction of these buildings, how they, how do they get digitized? How do you have those sensors that communicate with the cars and communicate with people? So with you guys, autonomous vehicles is one industry you have cornered and you've been really successful. What are you thinking? What are some of the other industries you all want to tackle or give some incentives as well?
Yeah, before we talk about that, just on
sure.
V2X, this vehicle to infrastructure kind of view, generally that hasn't worked. Lots of people have tried to do some version of vehicle to infrastructure communication, whether it's traffic lights or roads. The main reason it doesn't work, it's very expensive. Mm-hmm. And so the Tesla, Waymo, and every other startup in the self-driving space has basically assumed, especially in the US, the government is not going to be able to be capable of providing any infrastructure. If you look at the history of the car is invented in 1886. Mm-hmm. The stop sign is invented roughly in the late 1920s, and it's regulated in the US in 1952. Mm-hmm. You're talking about a 65, 70-year time horizon before you just regulate what a stop sign looks like.
Yes.
And so governments tend to always just move way, way slower than what industry needs. And I think within AI broadly, within autonomy specifically, waiting for governments to figure this out will not make founders and companies successful. So if you're a founder of an AI company, you have to keep moving. You can't wait for the regulatory kind of, let's say, debate to settle.
Yes.
In terms of where Applied and our company is going, I think that intersection of, we're a vehicle intelligence company. We provide intelligence to vehicles. Less than 1% of the vehicles in the world have any amount of intelligence in them right now. And so I think for the next 10, 20, 30 years,
not a market.
These are some of the biggest markets in the world. Automotive is 3% of the globe's GDP. Other industrials like commercial trucking are another couple percent, and you include defense, it's like 5% of the globe's GDP. It is one of the largest job makers and job creators and parts of the industry. So I think we will continue to provide intelligence into those organizations and those companies, and it will be fine.
So on that point, when a company starts to grow, you start to looking at acquiring a company.
Yeah, we've acquired.
And tell us a little bit about that. Why it's important to me is, I used to run the biggest procurement of small businesses selling to the government. And so when a small company starts getting contracts with the government, in the U.S., 23% of everything that the U.S. government buys has to be from a small business. And that entire procurement process, I've seen companies go from like 10 employees to 200 employees with a couple government contracts, which is some of the ways that governments can do better. And it's a dual-use defense tech company. Tell us a little bit about that and why.
Yeah, I mean, we operate in defense. We also have like a top secret clearance, so we do let's say things that are not public in the defense ecosystem. I think, broadly speaking, there was a time in Silicon Valley where software companies were somewhat resistant to work with the U.S. government, or specifically the Department of Defense.
I remember those days. You just deal with them.
Yeah, exactly. This is 10 years ago.
Exactly.
A little less, especially Google. There's I was at Google. There's a lot of controversy there.
Yeah.
I think because of Ukraine and some other geopolitical hotspots, I think everyone in Silicon Valley, or vast majority of companies in Silicon Valley, don't have that antagonistic view. My personal view is, if small and large tech companies in the West, and specifically in America, and specifically in Silicon Valley, don't support the U.S. government, we have some big problems.
Exactly.
This is a violent world, and we have to use the technologies at our disposal in order to protect our citizens and the institutions and the ideas we believe to be worth protecting, which is a capitalist democratic system, roughly. So that's why we support defense, and we have supported defense, and we'll continue to support defense in the future. I think in terms of the current administration, the Trump administration and DOGE, what's happening there is there's an increased focus on government efficiency, specifically in procuring technology for the Department of Defense specifically. Companies like us are well positioned because we're a dual-use company. And dual-use means we sell most of our technology for companies like Toyota and General Motors and Volkswagen and Traton, and commercial trucking, or Komatsu in mining. But then we also sell it to take that same technology, and for the needs of the U.S. government and Defense Department, we also sell to the Department of Defense. Why this dual-use strategy is important is because it makes the stuff that the U.S. government buys a lot cheaper. Mm-hmm. If the U.S. government and the Department of Defense have to create a bespoke version of everything that they are procuring, it's extremely expensive for taxpayers.
Exactly.
And so it
especially for taxpayers.
Taxpayer-led initiatives. And so I think dual-use, you'll continue to see the growth. There are actually laws in the U.S. which say if a commercial product is available, or if it's a defense-only product, they're required to buy the commercial product. Mm-hmm. I mean, one example is, imagine if the Department of Defense had to build a messaging system. You could spend $10 billion and have something worse than WhatsApp, or having something worse than, Facebook Messenger or something like this. So there is a lot of value in it. If you look at the adversaries of the United States, roughly Russia and China, they are using their public-private sector in a really one-hand-and-glove fashion. If you're a Chinese company in the private sector, you very much are a public company as well. You're extension. So in the West, and specifically in the US, private companies can choose if they want to work with the government or not. Is their freedom, and it's their right to choose it. But me as, again, a private citizen, I feel like those companies should, because it enables a much cheaper form of that technology to make it to our government, which is a giant procurement.
It's a giant procurement. And we could go on talking for hours. We're so happy to have you here. And we hope for you to come back to Barcelona. And you have a home here anytime. There's amazing entrepreneurs, amazing ecosystem. So please, let's thank Qasar for being here today and give him a big round of applause.